Why is it so hard to get a software engineering job in 2025? And what is the cause for all of the job market changes? I've been looking at this blog called The Pragmatic Engineer. This guy has like really interesting articles, and he goes into talking about how software engineering job openings have hit a 5-year low. Let's quickly go through this and we can kind of evaluate what he's saying here. Before we start, despite the below stats, the tech market is not all doom and gloom. This week, we cover pockets of the tech industry that are seeing more demand than before. So again, I think he's trying to preface this by saying that it's not as bad as it seems if you're just reading the news or just like on Reddit, looking at CS majors, seeing what people are talking about. So the first point that he's trying to talk about is that during the start of COVID and zero interest rates, this was sort of the initiator for tech industry to really hire a ton of people. So basically that was a time where it was maybe not necessarily what is typical for the CS industry. Because the interest rate was so low, basically there were a ton of active job listings. And I sort of entered the industry around the same time, or maybe the tail end of that. And literally recruiters were asking people who worked at their respective companies to put up names, put up emails to refer them to active job openings. And you can see this peak here for COVID and zero interest rate peak, where essentially there was huge job openings. Basically US, Australia, Germany, France, UK, all of the countries had sort of similar trends across the world. And the point that he tries to make here is that this graph compared to the number of total jobs in the industry is kind of similar, where you can kind of see also a peak during COVID for all job postings, and it sort of goes down as we enter 2025. And it's the same thing for software dev engineers. And he talks about how like the graph trend is kind of similar among sort of these popular job postings. The main difference is that the peak for software engineering is much higher, and the decline for software engineering roles is much higher as well. And why is that the case? Well, yeah, I mean, the numbers don't lie. Job listings have plummeted. It seems to me, at least, that the case for big tech companies is that they take more risk. Basically, when there was a 0% interest rate, there were a lot of people who started using the internet more. Like you can even see like in streaming for Twitch, like there was like huge viewership that increased during COVID. And a lot of these tech companies, because they are sort of quote unquote growth stocks, they respond very quickly to sort of the current customer climate, and they hired a ton during peak COVID. Comparatively to other industries, they hire faster. And that's where the pick program comes in, where like if there's overhiring, they start taking roles away. So just the response is faster, and then also a response to a decrease in trend is also faster as well. And this is sort of the first point that he tries to go into, that the response in at least tech startups is that they seem to react to sudden events with more intensity than any other industry. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, it's really hard to say. But at least for the people who were lucky enough to get into the job industry in 2020, 2021, they were able to at least get a job much easier compared to today. Okay, so that's the first part. The next point that this article tries to talk about is essentially regarding ChatGPT and LLMs. Now, I feel like I can speak to this because as a software engineer, I feel like I've been through the entire process. Where I first joined, essentially there were no LLM tools, and now there's like a ton of them internally and externally that you can use. We know firsthand that coding is an area in which large language models are really helpful. That is true. Indeed, it would be surprising if coding goes on to become the single best area of all LLMs to thrive in. Yeah, because there's so much code out there for LLMs to train on. And the thing is that programming languages are simpler than human languages, more high quality training materials available. Yeah, okay, so they talk about how there's more training materials available. And AI tool penetration is massive across developers. Last year, about 75% of engineers said that they use AI coding tools in our survey. And this is true. Like I see this being used all the time now. And there's even internal tools to help read your code base or just look at building tests, writing tests for you, writing certain parts of the code for you so that you don't have to worry too much about you still have to worry about sort of the overall architecture, but you don't have to worry about sort of the minutia or the details of how to set up your for loop, do certain methods, things like that. But the main question is, could tech companies be hiring less thanks to anticipating productivity boost that Gen AI tools could bring for existing engineers. I have some interesting thoughts about this, but let's go into what they're saying. A perception that engineering is no longer a bottleneck could be a reason for lower hiring. And this is the case for certain companies, like what they say here in Salesforce. They have kept their headcount flat because they've seen a 30% increase in productivity gain across AI tools. Secondly, still too many engineers after over recruitment 2021, 2022. Yes, they talk about how this is still occurring, but also for smaller teams, they're trying to be more efficient. For example, they go on to reference about how Linear, they only have 25 engineers because they deliberately use tools like OpenAI, Retool, RAM, things like that to build their product. And Blue Sky, 13 engineers, this social media startup crossed 30 million users with a surprisingly small team. So you're going to start to see these leaner companies with really small teams that are building things that millions of people can use. And yes, this is worrisome because the first part is that previously there have been articles even for the pragmatic engineer. He talks about, there was an article in the past. Let me search it up. So in like a previous article, maybe like a year ago, he talks about how like engineers scale linearly because essentially compared to other jobs, in Silicon Valley, basically tech is a huge profit center, not a cost center. Essentially, the more engineers you hire, the more profit you can make. The fact that the whole Gen AI thing is now occurring means that maybe this is not as true compared to before, where engineering is a huge profit center. I mean, it still is, but what they're saying is essentially that with less engineers, you can do just as much. So it's not necessarily the case that if you hire more engineers that you're going to continue to increase in profit, which was the case before, and essentially what this graph was about. So going back to what they're saying here, you're having smaller teams that are more efficient, and you're seeing cases where some of the bigger companies are doing sort of the wait and see thing, Salesforce, some of the bigger companies, because they don't know how much increase in productivity these LLMs are bringing. I actually think that this is pretty concerning, and I feel like the only part that leaves me with a bit of optimism is that, number one, there could be a case where, and they talk about this in the article down here, he talks about here how LLMs could make software development more accessible to non-developers so that there are maybe, in fact, more of these smaller companies that hire engineers to help out with some of their more complicated tech stack, things like that. And the other thing is that as you become more senior as a software engineer, coding is less important. You focus more on architecture, you focus more on optimizing systems, and you focus more on making optimal fixes to make your system more efficient and to build your service better and to maintain your service. However, that is super concerning for people who are new grads who are trying to join in, because a lot of these bigger companies are in a wait and see phase, and a lot of smaller companies maybe just want more experienced engineers to help build their more complicated tech stack. It's kind of like a closing the door behind you. Like if you're in the industry already and you have like senior positions, then you are still very attractive to these companies. But if you're entering as a new grad or you're trying to get an internship, there's going to be less roles. So that's it for this article, but I also have some personal thoughts of my own, which is, firstly, I want to talk a little bit more about the number of CS graduates, how much competition there is out there, and also if there are alternative industries such as banking, lawyer, doctor, and just do some quick comparisons of those traditional industries to see if there is essentially like a better alternative, like a better degree that could give you a higher chance of getting a job or having more success entering a specific industry. So I feel like that's super important to consider as well, which is like, what are the alternatives out there if you decide not to do or not to pursue CS? The first part is that in terms of statistics, okay, I need to be granted full access to this. But anyways, let me see if I can find an image for this. Okay, CS graduates in US and Canada. In both US and Canada, the number of bachelor's degrees has seen significant growth from 18,000 in 2010 to 52,000 in 2022. Okay, there are more CS graduates because I assume in the late 2010s, early 2020s, they saw the job boom, they saw how much people were getting paid in these bigger companies, And now CS has been one of the most attractive majors to be a part of. And I've even heard for students in Berkeley or certain places that it's really hard to get into classes because there's now more people in CS majors. However, one thing I want to say to put things into perspective is that people are concerned about the oversaturation in CS, but this is the case in other industries as well. For example, the mismatch continues between PhD holders and the career prospects in science. The article talks about the fact that in PhD it costs a ton of money, and afterwards, when you graduate, it's very difficult to find a professorship job in science. For example, this is the number of full-time teaching staff at Canadian universities, full-time professor. The numbers are relatively flat between 2015 to 2020. I remember looking at some other graphs back in the day when I was a PhD student before transferring into computer science. And basically, we had like PowerPoint presentations and meetings among students talking about how the roles are flat and people are not leaving the professorship positions. And this is a major problem, I know, for science, because a lot of people go into science majors thinking that they can go into med school. But then the problem is that quick facts about med school is that has remained relatively flat, at least in Canada and the US as well. People ratio in the US. As of 2022, the number of licensed physicians is 1 million at the time. So basically 313 licensed physicians per 100,000. I think this has sort of been relatively flat throughout the years. So basically there's not been an increase in physician and doctor roles. So this is a huge problem in Canada because it's mainly public healthcare system and there's less medical schools. And this is what this article, Basic Facts, is talking about. Now, the problem with this is that the number of science majors continues to increase. They think they can go into medical school or dental school or some professional program, but that remains relatively flat. It's just statistics. All of the additional science majors, what they end up trying to do is they end up getting PhDs. So then you have these overinflation of PhD students who end up not being able to get a professorship job because there's all of these professorships that have already, like all of these tenure professors who already have these roles, and there's no new additional roles. My point being is that if you go into science and you can't get into med school because of how competitive it is very screwed up because there is no professional industry in science. Well, there is. I mean, there's biotech jobs and things like that, but they have a similar type of situation with CS job postings where there's less and less. And most people want to become professors and go into PhDs, but the roles are relatively flat. So compared to CS jobs where, you know, there are boom cycles and more job postings, and here there isn't. Like the number of universities remains the same. Pretty much the number of job roles remains the same. And it's very, very difficult to become a professor. Anecdotally, I used to ask some of the professors when I did my PhD. I also knew a lot of professors, and they were saying 20, 30 years ago, you can just walk in and become an associate professor right away. But nowadays, you have to do, after a PhD, you have to do these you have to be placed as, what do they call it? I'm trying to remember. Post-PhD science students. Let's see. So postdocs, honestly, were not even a thing back in the day. But now, see, look, a postdoctoral crisis in Canada. Okay, I'm not going to go in too deeply into this article, but basically the main point is that postdocs were not even a thing back in the day. But now, if you are a PhD graduate in science, you pretty much have to try and do a postdoc and then pray that you can get a assistant professorship position somewhere. But from what I've heard, in a lot of the Canadian universities, you need to have a postdoc in a really a really great research lab, such as going to Harvard or something like that, for you to even have a chance to become an assistant professor in one of the Canadian or US universities. That's crazy. I guess one other thing I want to quickly mention is that if you want to become a doctor, you have to become a resident for quite a few years, and the salary is, the salary is still quite good down the line, but just comparatively speaking, in terms of British Columbia, you have a ton of loan debt, and then your starting salary is $60K, and then the next couple of years, it slowly increases until you get to over $100K in your 7th year as a resident. So one other thing to consider is that you have to do a ton of schooling, and as a resident, you're being paid not as much because they're working really long hours. Now, I'm not going to pretend that I know too much about lawyer jobs in the US trend. Like, I don't really know too much about the law industry, but it looks like it is projected to grow. One thing that I have to say about my friends who have become lawyers is that people complain in CS a lot about doing leak code, having more of these like leak code problems or system design interviews in multiple rounds. But the problem is that if you don't do that, you're going to have all of these like professional accreditation that you need. For example, accountant. Like every accountant needs to do these like CPA, these professional things to like level up on their professional license certificates to make sure that they are well accredited to distinguish themselves from other accountants. If you want to be a lawyer, you need to do the LSAT to get into law school. If you want to be a doctor, you need to do the MCAT to go into medical school. At this point, not necessarily the case for CS. You just need a bachelor's degree for CS to get into a big tech company. But in the future, that may change because there are more CS graduates now. Okay, so going back to all of this, in a lot of these professional industries, lawyer, banker, medical school, they already have maybe like a flatter increase in terms of job openings. All of these industries, you need to either have professional accreditation, professional certificates, do some type of huge like examination to get into these advanced degrees, or pray that you get into this like big postdoctoral to get into professorship. So objectively speaking, I feel like even though CS is really tough, at least there is a huge, robust professional industry that is continuing to grow. Even if AI continues to increase, I feel like there's going to be more tech companies that continue to grow as opposed to some of these other legacy industries, which have like sort of a firm hierarchy in terms of companies already. Right now, it is super rough. If you were to ask me, is it still worth doing a CS degree? I feel like it's definitely still worth it just because of the continued developments and the rapid pace in which things change in the tech industry. There's just going to be more opportunities out there compared to some of these legacy industries. If you are a CS major right now, hang in there. My sister's also in CS and she's also having her issues with finding internships. Honestly, I do see students still being able to get internships at big companies. There are still ways to break into the industry. It's just that comparatively to previous years, it's getting more and more difficult. I feel like that's just also a symptom with a lot of different industries. Like back in the day, in like the 70s, the 80s, you could buy a house and just make do with like a single person salary within a household. Now you see in a lot of families, there's more dual income families because of the fact that like housing prices are through the roof. And this generation alone, just the housing crisis, salaries, it's just very difficult in general for Gen Zers or the new generation just because of the fact that like a lot of the basic living costs as well as housing is just like way higher compared to the generation before us. So when a lot of parents think like, oh my goodness, like why is the new generation not doing so well? I think the main reason is the fact that right now just we're in a state of depression and there's a lot of things happening with the economy in general that is decreasing sort of the job market and making it more difficult for younger folks. So yeah, I definitely empathize with the situation for a lot of the younger people and just the economy in general for us compared to what it was before. Yeah, sorry about making this such a depressing topic, but it's just the reality of the situation. And I'll try and also create more and more resources to CS graduates and just try and do my part to help out to provide, my advice to how to get hired, things like that. Okay, see you guys in the next video.